welcome to all of you who are joining us for the lecture this evening. This is the second program in our Library for Lecture series, highlighting the treasures of the HUC Library collection, featuring leading scholars who will share their expertise with us. I'm very excited to participate in this event. As a student at Hebrew University and an assistant to my professor Menachem Kahana in the 1990s, I worked with the Geniza fragments for years and saw how the field changed dramatically over the last 20, 30 years. We used to sit near the microfilm machine, the old microfilm machine, in the basement of the National Library of Israel to read the Geniza fragments. However, the images were not of a good quality. If we wanted to have good images, we had to ask the institution that held the Geniza fragments to send pictures of the fragments, and it was not cheap. With the development of the field of digital humanities, work that used to take hours, days, or sometimes months could be done today with the help of the Friedberg Geniza in a few seconds. Along with over 1 million items, including books, manuscripts, microfilms, maps, broadsides, bookplates, music scores, stamps, and much more, the HUC libraries have around 400 to 500 Geniza documents. Some of the fragments are small, and I quote, the size of rice grains, as the fragments were described in the New York Times article on September 24th, 2014, almost 8 years ago, by Dwight Parmiano, a photographer who photographed the HUC Geniza collection. HUC Library is one of the more than 60 institutions and private collectors that own the roughly 350,000 fragments from the Cairo Geniza. However, the provenance of the HUC Geniza fragments is not clear. A number of the Geniza fragments are from the collection of Ludwig Blau, Talmudic scholar, historian, librarian, and rector of the Rabbinical Seminary of Budapest. Some were purchased by Professor Jacob Mann, who was a professor at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati and one of the early scholars of the Geniza period. Professor Mann purchased the fragments in 1924 and used them in his writing. Another collection of the Geniza, mostly the liturgical Geniza fragments, came to HUC from the Jewish community of Berlin, which were described in an article by Chaim Schirman, who was a professor of Jewish liturgy at Hebrew University. This event was made possible by a grant to promote scholarship and advance ideas at HUC-JIR, funded by the Office of the President. We are grateful for their support. Joining me today is our friend and colleague, Dr. Jennifer Grayson, and the movie producer, Michelle Paymar. Thank you very much, and I hope that you enjoyed the movie and you will enjoy the lecture.
Thank you so much for being here, and I'm so honored to be part of this presentation by the HUC Library. I don't know how many of you already knew about the Cairo Geniza or how many of you are just discovering it, but I'll talk a little bit about how I learned about the Geniza and how I came to make From Cairo to the Cloud. Many years ago, a friend told me about the Cairo Geniza, and she described it as an ancient Jewish time capsule. I was intrigued. And just as I wanted to learn more, 2 books about the Geniza were published: Sacred Trash by Adina Hoffman and Peter Cole, and Sacred Treasure by Mark Glickman. By the time I finished reading, I had completely succumbed to the Geniza's enchantments. What a story! How did I miss this? The documents found in the Ben Ezra synagogue form a collection larger, more varied, and from some perspectives, more significant than the Dead Sea Scrolls. Everybody knows about the Dead Sea Scrolls. But this was the greatest story of Jewish discovery I'd never heard of. I realized that as an Ashkenazi Jew from North America, my understanding of Jewish history was centered on the European experience, especially the Eastern European world of my immediate ancestors. The Sephardic experience, if it was mentioned at all, essentially began with the tragic expulsion from Christian Spain in the 15th century and ended with the tragic expulsion from Arab and Muslim countries in the mid-20th century. But the Cairo Geniza tells a different story. The Geniza reveals a rich Judeo-Arabic culture, especially during the 10th through 13th centuries, when 90% of the Jewish world lived under Islam. The Geniza bears witness to the fact that despite episodes of terror and violence, onerous taxes, and their second-class status as non-Muslims in a Muslim society, the Jews in medieval Cairo were able to flourish. It was a vibrant, thriving community enmeshed in the fabric of the larger society, yet proudly maintaining its separate Jewish identity. But until the Geniza was discovered, we didn't know much about this period. And today, over 125 years after Schechter, Geniza scholars continue to make new discoveries and develop extraordinary insights into this community. But the Cairo Geniza is still under the radar for most Jews, and I wanted to make a film that would hopefully focus attention on this remarkable treasure. And before I gave too much thought to the folly of making a documentary about documents, I was committed. And when I read about the massive international project to digitize nearly 500,000 Geniza documents from over 70 different collections and make them available online, I thought that would be an ideal way to bring the Geniza into the 21st century. So I called Ben Outhwaite, the head of the Taylor Schechter Geniza collection in Cambridge. I was sure that film crews were already on site to document the digitizing of the last fragments of the largest Jewish archive ever discovered. It certainly seemed like a big deal to me. And to probably no one's surprise but my own, no news or documentary crews were on the way. So I packed up my camera, lights, and microphone, flew to Cambridge, and filmed interviews and the conservation and digitizing process. Over the next few years, names begat names, and I ended up interviewing 40 Geniza scholars in the US, Canada, the UK, France, and Israel. I filmed at libraries, private collections, researched historical footage, selected manuscripts, and cast actors to read them. But I felt the documentary wouldn't really be complete until I could film inside the Ben Ezra synagogue itself, something that hadn't been allowed for decades. To do it, I would need to obtain lots of permission. I approached the Morsi regime and filled out papers. Then I approached the El-Sisi regime and filled out papers. And thus began a slow bureaucratic process that dragged on until the stars finally aligned in 2018. With the support of Sami Ibrahim and Magda Haroun from the Jewish community of Cairo, the Canadian consulate, and the invaluable guidance of an Egyptian colleague, Ahmed Kairat, I finally got the necessary approvals from all the government agencies that take an interest in such things. The Egyptian Ministry of the Interior, the Antiquities Ministry, the State Police, the Tourist Police, and finally the press office, where I was literally camped out the day before I was scheduled to shoot. On the day, I was beyond thrilled to finally be filming in the Ben Ezra. For the first time while shooting the film, I hired a crew and a crane and another camera person. And we were carefully observed by representatives of the Antiquities Ministry. I never could figure out what they were concerned about. And we had to film between groups of tourists, but I ended up with the images I needed. A few months later, I finished the film and started to get it out into the world. The film screened at over 30 festivals and was translated into French, Dutch, Arabic, and Bulgarian. Then in February of 2020, just before the world shut down, I was invited to screen the film with Arabic subtitles at the American University of Cairo, first at the old campus in Tahrir Square, and then a few days later at the new campus in New Cairo. The film was quite well received and followed by interesting discussions with the mostly Muslim audiences. But at both screenings, as I was getting ready to leave, people started approaching me privately. And they thanked me for making a film about Egypt and Egyptian history. And I was stunned. I thought I'd made a film about Jews and Jewish history. In fact, I thought the film could be seen to highlight the deep Jewish presence in Egypt that virtually vanished in the mid-20th century. And in 2018, I saw one of the many consequences of that latter-day Jewish exodus from Egypt at the Basatine Cemetery, the resting place of Cairo's Jews since the 9th century. With no one left to tend the graves, the marble headstones were stolen and it had become a garbage dump and squatters' camp. Now, in 2020, in 2022, it's even more of it is restored, but when I saw it in 2020, it was partly restored and will be one of several Jewish heritage sites to, quote, showcase Egypt's historical pluralism and highlight the country's cultural diversity, end quote. And it's both heartbreaking and heartening that Jewish sites in Egypt are being recognized, even in the absence of actual Jews. And somehow I can't help but be pleased that the young Egyptians who saw the film were embracing Jewish history as Egyptian history, because like them, I also found a part of my history in the Cairo Geniza. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you so much. I first just want to thank Michelle for being with us here today, sharing this film with us and introducing a wider audience to the complex and fascinating world of the Cairo Geniza. This film, I think, constitutes the best possible PR for the field of Geniza studies. So for that, I am eternally grateful to you. And I'm also so glad that all of you are joining us here on Zoom as well to watch it. And I want to thank Yoram and Abigail in the Klau Library, as well as the President's Office of HUC for making this event possible. I'm going to share my screen here. There we go. So today's event is intended to highlight the collection of some 740 Geniza manuscripts held at the Klau Library of HUC right here in Cincinnati. Every document that we have in the Geniza tells a story. It's a story both about the production of the document itself and also about the wider world that produced that document. But given the time constraints of today's event, I thought that I would focus on just 3 of the documents that we have in our collection so that we won't be here forever. And after my remarks, we will devote the remainder of our allotted time to a Q&A. The documents that I've chosen are of particular interest in my own studies on the social history of the Jews of the medieval Middle East. And I should note that somebody who specializes in liturgy or philosophy or biblical interpretation or magic, for that matter, would certainly find different treasures in our collection to highlight. So I want to begin with the manuscript on your screen here. This is a copy of a letter written in Baghdad in the middle of the 10th century and sent to the Jews of Spain. And this letter is particularly special because it constitutes one of the oldest surviving fundraising letters ever written by the leadership of a Jewish institution of higher learning. So perhaps it can give our development office some ideas. This is also one of the oldest Geniza documents in HUC's collection. Some background. Iraq, or the Hebrew or Aramaic term would be Babylonia in this context, was home to one of the largest and most ancient Jewish communities in the medieval world. It was the center of the development of rabbinic Judaism. The rabbis redacted the Babylonian Talmud in the yeshivot, or academies, of Sura and Pumbedita in Iraq between the 5th and 7th centuries CE. And in 750, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Muslim Caliphate, came to power, and they established their capital right here at Baghdad. And so that meant that then Iraq really became the center of the Islamic world. And that event also propelled the yeshivot of Iraq, who were now led by rabbinic figures known as Geonim, and that brought them to prominence in the Jewish world. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, Jewish communities worldwide wrote to the Babylonian Geonim for advice on halachic issues. In return, these distant communities sent donations that were used for the upkeep of the yeshivot and for providing stipends to their students. The yeshivot relocated to the imperial capital of Baghdad in the late 9th and early 10th centuries. But then in the middle of the 10th century, the Abbasid Caliphate basically collapsed. These events, this collapse of the centralized authority in Baghdad actually helped to facilitate the rise of the Fatimid Caliphate and the rise of Cairo as a major political and economic center. Back in Iraq, however, this was a time of major poverty and hardship. And this brings us to our letter. In this letter, the Gaon bemoans the poverty that has befallen Babylonia. He emphasizes that the scholars of the yeshiva now have no way to support themselves, and they've taken on a lot of debt, so some things maybe never change. The Gaon reminds his readership that they are Torah scholars, and they have Torah scholars in their communities only because their own rabbis had had the opportunity to study in the yeshivot of Baghdad. And he reminds the community of their sacred, God-given obligation to support the yeshivot. But here's where this letter becomes interesting, not just for people who care a lot about the history of rabbinic institutions, of which, to be fair, I am one, but also for thinking about global economic history more broadly. So in this letter, the Jews of Spain are instructed to send their donations to a certain Rabbi Shaul ben Yosef in Kairouan, which is in modern-day Tunisia. And then he, in turn, will send the funds on to a certain Rabbi Marwan ben Abraham, who is the treasurer of the yeshivot in Baghdad. And the Gaon emphasizes that these guys are really, really trustworthy individuals. After all, you don't just want your money going to anyone because, they could abscond with it. And it's important to emphasize what's actually happening here. These funds are traveling really, really far. To be clear, they're not carrying this in cash. Instead, Shaul ben Yosef here in Kairouan would have received the funds from the Jews of Spain and written a sort of money order, kind of like a check, like a modern check. The rabbi in Kairouan would then send this on to his counterpart in Baghdad, to the treasurer of the yeshiva, and then he would then go on to cash this check. But he would not have just cashed any check that he received. Instead, he would only have cashed a check, a sort of money order, from somebody that he actually already had an economic partnership with. That meant that each of them could stand as surety and actually guarantee that this money literally existed. And it's probably no coincidence that Marwan, who is the new treasurer in Baghdad, is actually described as a Maghribi, or as a Westerner. He's probably from somewhere in North Africa, and so he actually would have had a kind of connection to the people who can send money based in Kairouan. And overall, with the network of wealthy merchants and bakers that the yeshivot were increasingly having to rely on, because Baghdad and the Eastern Islamic world is a bit of a mess right now. So all in all, this letter attests to a remarkably sophisticated financial transaction that is taking place across a distance of over 6,000 kilometers. We often think of the medieval world as being very localized, but this letter and so many others in the Geniza demonstrate how interconnected and globalized the medieval world really was. Thus far, I've talked about this document as a text, as a collection of words. But this letter is not just free text. It is also a material object. And the very materiality of this letter also tells us something about the world that created it. First, that Gaon specifies that he sent the letter in 2 copies because the road could be dangerous, because of the dangers inherent in traveling. And he wanted to make sure that it actually arrived at its intended destination. Messengers then would have transported the letter on established trade routes, and they would have basically passed through each city along the way, including Fustat. In each city that the letter got to, a rabbinic official would then actually copy the writings of the Babylonian Gaonim that got there. And so the copy in HUC's collection is this document here is one such copy that basically, when the letter passed through Fustat, a scribe, probably some official of the synagogue, decided to copy out this letter so that he could have a copy to consult for himself. And he copied this document on vellum, which is calfskin. And that's a little bit surprising because vellum would have been rather expensive. It's one of 2 permissible surfaces for writing a Torah scroll. But the scribe did not purchase this piece of vellum just for copying this one fundraising letter. He actually wrote the text on recycled vellum. If we flip to the other side of the document, we see that our scribe copied the letter on the back of a Megillat Esther, so an Esther scroll, which is read on Purim. Presumably, this scroll became damaged or stopped being used. And rather than just get rid of it, the scribe chose to put it to a new use. Because he flipped the scroll from horizontal to vertical, nobody would get the 2 texts confused. Why would he do this? There's a simple answer. Even in medieval Egypt, writing surfaces, whether we're talking about parchment, vellum, papyrus, or paper, were quite expensive. By repurposing the Esther scroll in this fashion, the scribe ensured that this valuable piece of vellum did not go to waste. This practice might surprise us. I certainly can't think of any synagogue today where a rabbi or a treasurer might take out an old Esther scroll and write a sermon or high holiday appeal speech on the back of it. But this manuscript demonstrates how varied Geniza practices were, even among Jews living in so-called Geniza society. Geniza was not just about disposal or about the sanctity of the written word. It was also a practice of reuse in a world characterized by material scarcity. And today, when we are increasingly conscious of our own material impact on the environment and the importance of recycling, I find this quite inspiring. All right. The second document I want to discuss today supplies a rather different and more humble perspective on Jewish life in medieval Egypt. This is an inventory of an estate from the 11th century. It contains a list of the owner's household goods written in Judeo-Arabic. And this is one of hundreds of such lists in the Cairo Geniza. These lists provide a bird's eye view into the daily lives of Geniza Jews, including non-elites. The owner of the goods on this list was a copyist or a scribe, and some of the items that are listed here give us particular insights into that profession. And I should note that this is all written in Judeo-Arabic. First, we learn where the scribe stored his extra paper and parchment, in a bamboo basket. And lists from the Geniza, I should note, are replete with mentions of all sorts of baskets for the storage of different kinds of goods. Again, storage and the problem of fitting everything that you have in a small apartment is certainly not a new phenomenon. Second, any scribe needs access to a source of light. Our scribe here possessed a, quote, joint lamp made of wood with a movable head. That meant that he could adjust the lamp to either light up the entire room or bend it down to use as a reading lamp. So in some ways, a similar kind of functionality to the very modern lamp that is on the right of your screen. And third, we know that Geniza scribes did not buy their own ink. but they typically made their own at home. So our scribe here possessed an iron mill for grinding gall nuts to produce the sort of waterproof ink that we see on the Geniza documents in our possession. Finally, you might notice the large Arabic script on this side of the document. I wasn't really able to read this, but the Arabic is here for one of two reasons. Either the paper was originally part of an Arabic document that a Jewish scribe later obtained and repurposed, or someone wrote a note in Arabic script about the contents of this document. Either way, it points to the intersections between Jews and Islamic and Arabic culture and society throughout the Geniza period. I want to conclude by briefly discussing one of the most famous Geniza documents in our collection. This is a page from a Shabbat Siddur, or prayer book. It was written by Ovadia Hager, who was actually born with the birth name of Johannes of Oppido. He was a Norman Christian monk from the south of Italy, and he converted to Judaism in the year 1102. And of course, the reason that we know that it was the year 1102 is precisely because of the manuscript that we have here at HUC. So Obadiah, or Ovadia, then fled Italy after his conversion, and he traveled through Constantinople, Baghdad, Damascus, Aleppo, and Tyre, and then on to Egypt, where he wrote a memoir of his journey. This memoir, the only one of its kind, is also preserved in the Cairo Geniza. So Ovadia Hager may be quite unique, and he certainly was, but his life also exemplifies the kind of religious and cultural diversity of the medieval Mediterranean and the world of the Cairo Geniza. After he converted to Judaism, Ovadia actually set Hebrew prayers to Gregorian chant, which is the plain chant of the Western Roman Catholic Church. And in his own Hebrew prayer book, this Norman former monk wrote the directions for the worshiper, not in Hebrew, not in French, but in Judeo-Arabic. So in sum, I know this is just a little taste, but I hope that watching the documentary and hearing these presentations has given you a taste of the rich, complex world of the Cairo Geniza. I again want to thank all of my co-panelists, and I look forward to your questions and to the rest of our discussion today. Thank you very much. And let me stop sharing my screen. All right. All right, so I guess let's start this off then with a question for Michelle, which is a question that actually came in, I guess, before today's Zoom meeting. One of you submitted it online, which is, how did you decide which items to feature in the film or which people or researchers to include? And I think you need to unmute, and there we go.
All right. It was really, really difficult. I wanted very much for the Geniza story to be told in the first person by all of these scholars, because I felt like I was having one conversation with 40 different people. And so a lot of it was a bit of a jigsaw puzzle and figuring out how best to do that. In terms of the fragments, it was really, really difficult. There were some fragments that I just kept wanting to put in, and you just keep pounding away and figuring it out. And then suddenly one day you take it out and everything else works. So there were some fragments that in order to understand them, you can't just present them. There's a whole story, or it really won't make a lot of sense. So I had to identify the fragments that were going to tell a story, and specific stories about specific topics in a way that was somewhat condensed. And And one of the, I really wish I could have included that sheet music. In fact, I had found a recording from the Obadiah HUC-JIR and the Gregorian chant, and I thought that was just fascinating, but I just couldn't find a way in.
Thank you. And we have another question, which has to do with Michelle, you might have some insight into this from your recent visit to Cairo. So has Cairo or the Egyptian government ever demanded the return of any particularly valuable items from the Cairo Geniza, such as Maimonides' writings? I think you're in. Yoram, do you have any?
No.
Okay. I will say, and Michelle, somehow, are you able to unmute? No.
Ah, okay.
Yes.
It said the host had to unmute me. I couldn't unmute myself for a moment there. I'm sorry, what was the question?
The question had to do with whether Cairo or the Egyptian government has ever demanded the return of any particularly valuable Geniza documents.
Not that anybody mentioned to me, but I think Yoram can speak to this as well. There was earlier this year, as they were doing the excavations and the restoration of the Basatine Cemetery, they uncovered a cache of, we don't even know how many documents. It looked like dozens of bags, and they were just unceremoniously put into literal garbage bags, but transported to somewhere. And some people, and they haven't let anybody really look at them. And some people have suggested that one of the reasons they might have done that was because they didn't want anybody to take it. I'm not sure. Another theory was that these may have been more recent documents, and perhaps the government was afraid that there would be things like deeds to houses, and that there would be people, Egyptian Jews making claims. I don't know. Maybe Yoram is, or Jennifer can explain a little bit more about that.
I truly do not know. However, I just visited recently in the British Museum, and I was also surprised, I don't know, amazed that not that I aware that they asked the British Museum to retain all the amazing collection that's in the British Museum.
Yeah.
But I'm not aware.
Yeah. I'll just add to this that there has also been some discussion of there are a number of other very valuable, medieval Hebrew manuscripts, old Torah scrolls that were preserved in other synagogues in Cairo, and some of them are still there. And there was recently an article published in the Jewish Quarterly Review that was sort of arguing that this should belong to the Egyptian Jewish community. And of course, this raises all sorts of questions, because what exactly is the Egyptian Jewish community at this point? But I'm not aware specifically that anybody has called for the return of the Geniza, but I think the question has to do with the other aspects of Jewish cultural heritage that are still in Egypt and what's going to happen to them. All right, we have another question. So if you could say a few words about the Friedberg Geniza project. Who are the Friedbergs? How and why did they create their institution? And how did they obtain so much cooperation among many schools? And I should note that I came to doctoral studies after the Friedberg Geniza project had thankfully already been created. So I'm also very interested to hear about this history.
Alfred Dov Friedberg is a fascinating guy. He is a businessman, a hedge fund manager, and while running his business, he went to school and became a scholar and got his PhD in, I believe his thesis was about Maimonides. So he was very, very interested in the Geniza. And when there had long been this idea of creating some sort of central corpus, but it was just so prohibitively expensive that nobody had attempted it until they got to a certain point when suddenly the technology was available and it was inexpensive. And so Friedberg basically invested in the creation of this website, which I visited the Friedberg Geniza offices when in Jerusalem. This was quite a while ago. And very interestingly, almost all of the programmers, the designers, everybody were Orthodox women. And it was all under the auspices of an amazing man named Yaakov Shweka, of blessed memory. He was the head of the whole thing. And in addition to being a Geniza scholar, he is a scientist and received the Israel Prize and is one of these rare human beings who could somehow mesh the technical end with the larger historical and archival sensibility. And he's also was a really exceptionally charming person. And I think that was some of how he did it, but he actually was able to gain permission from all of these places. There are some gaps, Library of St. Petersburg, and there are a few other collections. I tried very hard to get into St. Petersburg, but it was just no joy. So that was really how Friedberg came to be involved in it. And then it became more and more complex, and this jigsaw function was developed. And now I think that there's an umbrella organization that is over that. It's really a great gift. I mean, it's fun to spend time on it, but if you don't have the Hebrew and the Judeo-Arabic, it's a little limiting. But it's a lot of fun. I urge everyone to go check it out.
Thank you. So the next question that came in, why are the fragments still spread all over the world, even though it's now been digitized? So I want to direct that towards Yoram in his capacity as the director of this library.
So Jennifer, I don't understand the question. Should we give away the fragments?
Yeah, I guess the question has to do with, if say JTS has one half of a document and Cambridge has the other half, why aren't those two, just being joined together and stored in the same place?
So they are online. They are the Friedberg Geniza put them together. So I don't know. So again, this is something that belongs to the HUC library. This is part of the HUC library probably for the last 100 years. So, and unfortunately, there are many institutions, probably 60 or more, that, and also private collectors that hold the Geniza fragments. So, but today with technology, it's again with the Friedbergs, you can the program can match them easily.
Yeah, it's a matter of we still have sort of ownership of these documents in all of these different places. And this is kind of the beauty of the online sphere in terms of being able to join them up while still maintaining, being able to experience the documents in both ways. So the next question, I was surprised to see people in the film touching the documents. I would think oil from people's hands would cause the documents to deteriorate. Can you comment?
Oh yeah, I was, the whole time I was watching Lucy do the documents with her bare hands, I was thinking there's something wrong with this. This is right. And I asked her on camera, in fact, I included it in earlier cuts because I knew a lot of us would have been alarmed. Actually, before she works with the documents, of course, she washes her hands very carefully, but they need to have very, very fine control over their implements and over the document. And if they're wearing gloves, they could actually do more damage. So, and her hands, needless to say, they were very dry and kind of a mess because she was doing this and working with these substances. But that's how it's done now. And
Yes,
it was,
so
kind of amazing. And I got to touch some documents too, and it was, it was kind of mind blowing. I felt like I was doing something that should have been illegal.
So yes, I agree, Michelle. So in the past, people used to give you a white gloves, but then they realized that the touch of the paper or the volume, you cannot sense the paper while you are having holding the book with a glove. So we do not use gloves anymore. There are more damage by using the glove than using your hand, but you need to wash your hand before.
Yeah.
And after.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I'll note that, I mean, this is true for really working with any sorts of rare books. I also teach undergraduates at Xavier University, and when I take them to the rare book room, they're also always shocked that they actually get to touch the books. But again, we don't want somebody, if you've ever tried to flip a book page using gloves, you know that never goes well.
Yeah.
All right, so another question. So relating to documents in history. That just came in. Are we as a community burying these books in cemeteries in order to destroy them? And isn't that contrary to our, quote, luck at finding these ancient texts now? So I think my understanding is that this is maybe referring back to, so I'm not sure if this is specifically about the Geniza documents or thinking about sort of modern practices of Geniza. But if either of you have thoughts about this question.
It just occurred to me that, the Geniza documents weren't meant to come to us. This was, we could, there's a reason why it was called sacred trash. It was stuff that was thrown away for one reason or another. And there are a lot of different theories about why this stuff was never buried. We know that community did bury because we found documents in the Bassettine Cemetery and other places. They did bury some things. But the actual Geniza chamber is really, really big. And it's deep. It's, I don't know, I would guess about 18 feet deep, maybe 5 meters deep, and maybe 6 or 7 feet this way, and not that deep that way, the actual width. But it was obviously constructed so that they didn't have to bury it for a really long time. And some scholars have suggested that relates to an anti-Jewish episode, and when the Jews were going to taking documents to the cemetery to bury them, and there was a riot and death, and so when they rebuilt the synagogue, they made it so that it basically didn't have to be emptied. But I learned that there are lots and lots of traditions of Geniza, and different cultures, different Jewish cultures, do it in different ways. There are some groups that actually put them in bags and put them into the river, so they would naturally decompose. But it is true that we were kind of eavesdropping on these conversations, and they weren't really meant to come to us, which is part of what makes it so interesting. You're reading everybody else's mail. What could be better?
Yeah, I'll also note that I think increasingly we're seeing that Muslims in this part of the world did have similar practices. Islam has similar ideas about how to treat sacred writings, but there's also various old mosques, particularly one in Damascus, that actually contain many old discarded manuscripts that are were stored in the attic. And it's a similar kind of thing where you have this collection of mostly sort of sacred writings, but also many documents as well, and many documents not just in Arabic, but in other languages as well. So,
wow.
I think one of the big questions we're asking is what we're seeing. A lot of things were preserved in Egypt because of the climate, and there's a lot of questions about, what else is out there, what else used to be out there that we just don't have access to anymore. And there probably are many, many, many different ways of doing this idea of Geniza. And maybe it's very likely that even people living in the same place may have had different ideas about what exactly they were doing here. And with the Cairo Geniza, what is the Geniza practice in the 10th century versus what is the Geniza practice and how is this understood in the 12th century, in the 15th century, in the 18th century? And that's also a story as well. And there also likely is change over time there as well. All right, so some other questions that have come in. All right, so how did the Geniza end up at all of these different institutions once Schechter brought it to Cambridge?
Well, before Schechter came on the scene, there were all kinds of people dealing in manuscripts. It was a period when Europeans were coming to Egypt and to other countries and just hauling everything away. I guess the joke was that the first people get the mummies and the last people end up with paper. But it was something that had been happening for a long time. I think that the community members at that point in the late 19th century, this stuff, it was trash. It wasn't really considered to be something valuable. Also there was looting, there was theft, there was unscrupulous behavior. There were manuscript dealers who would tear a manuscript in half and sell both, and but this was a period where there was a tremendous amount of manuscript collecting going on in general, and all kinds of people were interested in it. And there were some very sizable collections, family collections that were assembled by people through dealers or people who might have had a direct contact with the Ben Ezra.
Yoram, do you want to add anything there? Yeah, I'll also say Schechter didn't get everything, and
no, he didn't. Yeah.
Yes, and so that especially helps to explain, say, in our library, when Jacob Mann traveled to Cairo in 1924, he was able to look at a lot of Cairo Geniza manuscripts in Cairo itself, and he also apparently purchased some and brought them back to us as well. Yeah. In terms of the history of scholarship. So we got a question. Do researchers today on the Cairo Geniza cooperate, or is there any modern rivalry similar to the Schechter-Oxford race to publish Ben Sira? So Yoram, I want to ask you that first with your experience in Israeli academia.
All the time. Yes.
Yeah. I would say, I think, I haven't really had that experience. I've had I think a nicer experience, but I think also something that digitization does that's really interesting is it means that, one thing that's so fascinating is when you're working on this scholarship, these early scholars, they would buy manuscripts and just hold on to them, and then they'd publish them. And sometimes they don't even tell you where the manuscript is now. They'll say, oh yeah, I found this in the Geniza in Cairo, or in one of the Genizas in Cairo, and then they publish it and you have no way to find it. Today, I think, you don't have to sort of claim ownership of one document or one manuscript. And I think, we can increasingly see that multiple people can study the same thing and each one of them can yield important insights. But yeah, I don't think petty scholarly rivalries will ever go away.
Although I must say, when I was interviewing people, I was kind of blown away by, it was a small universe of Geniza scholars and everyone seemed to know one another, and there was tremendous appreciation, and also a lot of collaborating, and a lot of, now I think that there's some sort of crowdsourcing going on with the Geniza project, that people who have expertise can, whether they're scholars or interested amateurs, but people who might be able to contribute to a translation or to a discussion of what something might mean. And this is, online and open source. And I know that somebody like Marina Rustow, for example, at Princeton, regularly works with other scholars because everyone has a different understanding of, and also a different proficiency level. Tamara Alethi is a native speaker of Arabic. So to have him in the room while you're trying to figure out what something is saying is incredibly valuable. And I think among at least the younger generation, it seemed like there was a tremendous amount of interest and support. That was my feeling. I mean, I'm not in that world, and maybe everybody was putting on a good face, but I was, in fact, I found the opposite. People were so helpful.
So another question specifically about the physical space of the Geniza at the Ben Ezra Synagogue. So in the film that they said that Schechter had to jump in. So how far is the window or doorway from the window to the floor? And was there a ladder that he was able to take?
He had a ladder. Really? Yeah, I had a ladder. It was maybe a 10-foot ladder. And it's far to the bottom. And unless it had been full of documents to absorb his fall, he would have broken something. So I can only imagine how packed it was. Because it's rather deep. So, I mean, yeah, I had some questions about that too. It's like, how did he do that? He might have had a long ladder on the other side. I don't know, but he describes jumping in.
Thank you. So I think should we wrap up now or do one more question? All right. So another question that came in was just, have we found other Genizas in addition to the Cairo Geniza?
Yoram?
Yes, the answer is yes. So we have what we call today the European Geniza. So this is thousands of pieces, or sometimes in a entire leaf that were used to bind a manuscript or a book. So the church let the scholars to remove the cover from the book. So this is what we call the European Geniza. And also, a few years ago, it's still not clear, someone brought a huge collection from Kurdistan. They are now belong to the National Library of Israel, so it's not clear how they came to Israel, but this is something that also scholars now working on. It's a very important document because we really do not know a lot about the Jews in Kurdistan since the 10th centuries until the 17th or 18th centuries.
Yeah, and there's also have been Genizot found. There's one from Morocco, but it's mostly 18th and 19th century material. So in terms of the medieval stuff.
So yes, but this is big. The European Geniza from the Kurdistan are a large collection of Geniza.
Yeah, thank you. And then just final question: is there a Cincinnati Geniza? I mean, we have one in our library, in our offices. I don't know.
What does it mean? Geniza, that people bury books? I'm sure that they.
Yeah. At JTS, there, you know, if you're making, remember Xeroxes, but if you're making copies in the copy room, there's a bin that says for the Geniza, because you might be copying something sacred. And as you saw in the film, in the community in upstate New York that I filmed doing their Geniza burial, it was just a closet. You know, it just, it can be anything. And in Israel, they're on the streets in certain areas where you can see a box if you've got a book that you need to get rid of, but you don't want to just have it pulped. You can put it in the Geniza. I don't know what happens after that, but you know, you trust it's being taken care of. But it's very moving to me, this burial of books. That you know, for someone who loves books, that seems fitting.
I would just chime in that at the library, we definitely make a distinction between handwritten manuscript material versus printed. So things like photocopies, we don't really treat with the same sanctity as a rare printed book that has decomposed, and obviously things that are handwritten that would have unique value, those would be treated even more carefully. And one of the fun things about the Klau Library, we have a used book sale every year where things that are duplicates in our collection get kind of the second home and go elsewhere for people to study and enjoy. So things that are, you know, somebody else's trash in a sense become someone else's treasure.
I think there was a question about Amitav Ghosh and Dara Horn.
Go ahead.
They're both, Dara is a scholar, as actually was Amitav Ghosh, and they're novelists. And they, Amitav Ghosh wrote an amazing book called In an Antique Land, which chronicles his time as a Geniza scholar in Cambridge and his experiences learning Arabic in Egypt, and his discovery of an Indian character named Ben Yiju in the Geniza. And as a man from India himself, he was really interested in studying this. And so his book is a nonfiction book, exceptionally for him, that talks a lot about the Cairo Geniza, and he's quite an expert on it. And then Dara Horn is, you know, an amazing novelist and thinker. Her latest book is Everybody Loves Dead Jews, which I highly recommend. And she wrote a wonderful novel about the Geniza that was called Guide for the Perplexed. And it dealt with the issue of what if there was a kind of, in the near future, a kind of Geniza program that used all of the various devices we always have with us to essentially make a Geniza about your life, every aspect of your life and every aspect of your children's lives. You'd be able to look back on it. And so this novel is kind of a thriller about the scientist who develops that. You know, there have been other wonderful novels that deal with the Geniza. Last Watchman of Old Cairo is a beautiful book. So it's really been a source of inspiration for a lot of people, I think.
So thank you, Michelle, for your time and for your movie. It's really a beautiful, inspiring movie. And I hope to see or hear about your next movie. So, and thank you, Jennifer, for your time. It was a really beautiful lecture about the HUC Library Geniza fragment. And thank you, Abigail, for your hard work to have this event. And I wish you, everybody, thank you and good night and Happy New Year.